Coffee was once banned by kings, smuggled across oceans, and built on slavery. Today, 2 billion cups are consumed every single day. So how did a small wild berry from Ethiopia become one of the most powerful commodities in human history? This isn't the story of a drink. It's the story of how coffee changed the world. And it begins in silence, in a place with no coffee shops, no espresso machines, no baristas, just mountains, mist, and a berry no one yet understood. Ethiopia, the highlands of Kaffa, sometime before the 9th century, though no one can say exactly when. Historians will tell you plainly, we do not know who first discovered that this fruit could be brewed into something extraordinary. What we do have is legend, and legends, even unproven ones, tell us something about how a culture remembers its own turning points. The most famous version involves a goat herder named Kaldi. As the story goes, Kaldi noticed his goats becoming unusually energetic, almost dancing, after chewing on the bright red cherries of a certain shrub. Curious, he tried the berries himself and felt the same surge of alertness. He supposedly brought the fruit to a nearby monastery, where a monk, suspicious of anything that produced such energy, threw the berries into a fire. The roasting beans released an aroma so intoxicating that the monks pulled them from the flames, ground them, and dissolved them in hot water, creating, quite by accident, the world's first cup of coffee. It is a wonderful story. It is almost certainly not true, at least not in this form. The tale of Kaldi was not written down until centuries later by a European writer in the 1600s, long after coffee had already conquered the Islamic world. Historians such as Mark Pendergrast and William Euchers have noted that Kaldi may be nothing more than a folk explanation invented to give a mysterious plant a satisfying origin myth. What we can say with more confidence is this: Coffee Arabica evolved naturally in the forests of southwestern Ethiopia, and the region's indigenous peoples, particularly the Oromo, likely consumed it in some form, possibly mixed with animal fat, as a portable energy source for warriors and travelers. Long before anyone thought to brew it as a drink, this was not coffee as we know it. It was fuel, sustenance, a way to survive long journeys across difficult terrain. The transformation from chewed berry to brewed beverage almost certainly did not happen in Ethiopia at all. It happened after the plant crossed the Red Sea. Picture the Gulf of Aden around the 15th century. Trade routes stretching between the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, carrying not just coffee, but ivory, gold, textiles, and enslaved people. A grim reminder that global trade networks, even in this era, were built on human suffering as much as commerce. Somewhere in this exchange, coffee cherries made their way into Yemen, and it was here, in the dry mountain terraces of southern Arabia, that something remarkable happened. Yemeni farmers didn't just consume the fruit, they cultivated it deliberately, refined the roasting process, and began brewing it into a drink meant to be savored, shared, and discussed. The forgotten berry of Ethiopia was about to become the most talked about drink in the Islamic world. And that shift, from wild plant to cultivated commodity, would set off a chain reaction that no one in those mountain villages could possibly have imagined. By the early 1400s, in the Sufi monasteries of Yemen, coffee had found its first true believers. Sufi mystics practiced long nights of devotional prayer and chanting, seeking a state of spiritual closeness to the divine. The problem was simple. The human body needs sleep, and prayer does not wait for sunrise. Coffee, with its ability to sharpen focus and hold back exhaustion, became the perfect companion to worship. Accounts connect the Shadhili Sufi order to some of the earliest deliberate use of coffee as a devotional aid, brewed and passed among worshippers to sustain them through the night. From the monasteries, the habit spread outward, from the mosque to the marketplace, from the mystic to the merchant. And in the port city of Mocha, coffee found its gateway to the world. Mocha would lend its name to coffee itself, becoming so synonymous with the drink that centuries later, people would still use the word to describe a coffee-chocolate blend, largely forgetting it was ever a real city on the Yemeni coast. From Mocha's harbor, sacks of dried coffee beans were loaded onto ships bound for Mecca, Cairo, Damascus, and Constantinople, carried in part by pilgrims completing the Hajj, who returned home not just with religious devotion, but with a taste for this strange new brew. By the early 1500s, coffee had reached Mecca itself, and something entirely new began to take shape: the coffee house. These were not casual cafés. In cities like Cairo, Damascus, and later Constantinople, the coffee house, known as the café, became something closer to a public institution. Men gathered there not just to drink, but to talk, to debate poetry, to play chess, to discuss business deals and political grievances, to hear news read aloud, and occasionally, to plot against those in power. Historians studying the Ottoman Empire have described these coffee houses as among the first genuinely public spaces where social class mattered less than conversation itself. A merchant might sit beside a scholar, a soldier beside a poet. In a rigidly structured society, coffee created a strange pocket of leveling, and this is exactly what made rulers nervous. If people are gathering to talk, they might also be gathering to conspire. Between the 1500s and 1600s, coffee and coffee houses were banned outright on multiple occasions across the Islamic world. In Mecca in 1511, a local governor named Khair Beg reportedly grew alarmed that coffeehouse gatherings were becoming breeding grounds for criticism of local authorities and ordered coffee banned and stockpiles burned. The ban did not last. Complaints reached Cairo. The ruling sultan reportedly enjoyed coffee himself, and the prohibition was overturned within the year. In the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Murad IV took an even harsher stance in the 1600s, reportedly patrolling the streets of Constantinople in disguise and personally punishing those caught drinking coffee, according to several historical accounts, though the more extreme punishments attributed to him should be treated with some caution, as they come largely from later retellings rather than contemporary court records. None of it worked. Coffee had already become too woven into daily life, too central to commerce, too pleasurable to abandon. Every ban was eventually reversed, every crackdown eventually failed, and coffee houses kept reopening under new names in new alleyways. By the late 1500s, coffee wasn't just a drink anymore. It was infrastructure. It moved gossip, it moved business deals, it moved political sentiment, all while people simply believed they were enjoying an afternoon drink. And word of this strange, addictive, conversation-fueling brew was beginning to travel north, carried by merchants, travelers, and diplomats into a Europe that had never tasted anything like it. The Islamic world had already discovered what coffee could do to a society. Europe was about to find out for itself. Venice, early 1600s. Merchant ships arriving from Ottoman ports carried silk, spices, and sacks of strange dark beans that Venetian traders had started calling the wine of Islam. By the 1610s and 1620s, coffee had entered European port cities through Venice's extensive Mediterranean trade networks. At first, some Catholic clergy viewed it with suspicion, calling it a drink of the infidel. According to popular legend, Pope Clement VIII was urged to ban it, tasted it himself, and declared it too delicious to leave only to non-believers. Supposedly even joking, it should be baptized. Historians treat this story with some skepticism, since it appears in later accounts rather than contemporary documentation. But true or not, coffee was never banned by the Church, and it spread through Italy largely unopposed. From Venice, it moved to Vienna, Paris, Amsterdam, and London, and in each of these cities, something remarkable happened. Coffee didn't just get consumed, it got institutionalized. London's first coffee house opened around 1652, and within decades, the city held thousands of them. They were nicknamed penny universities. For the price of a single coffee, a person could sit for hours among merchants, scientists, and writers, absorbing ideas and arguments that would once have required years of formal education to access. Consider what grew out of these rooms. Lloyd's of London, now one of the most significant insurance markets on earth, began as Edward Lloyd's Coffee House, where ship captains, merchants, and underwriters gathered to discuss maritime risk over cups of coffee. The London Stock Exchange traces part of its lineage to Jonathan's Coffee House, where stockbrokers gathered to trade shares after being banned from the Royal Exchange for rowdy behavior. Meanwhile, in Paris, coffee houses like the Café Procope became gathering places for writers and philosophers. Voltaire reportedly drank enormous quantities of coffee daily. Some accounts suggest dozens of cups mixed with chocolate, fueling both his prolific writing and his sharp wit. Denis Diderot and Jean-Jacques Rousseau are believed to have frequented similar establishments, where Enlightenment ideas about reason, liberty, and human rights were debated late into the night over endless refills. Would the Enlightenment have unfolded the same way without coffee? We cannot know for certain, but it is difficult to ignore how neatly the rise of coffeehouse culture across Europe overlapped with an explosion of scientific societies, financial innovation, and revolutionary political thought, all fueled, quite literally, by a substance that kept minds sharp long after the wine and beer of previous centuries would have dulled them. But Europe wanted more than coffee houses. It wanted control of the supply itself. For most of the 1600s, Yemen held a near monopoly on coffee cultivation, and Yemeni authorities guarded that monopoly fiercely, reportedly forbidding the export of fertile, unroasted beans to prevent rival cultivation elsewhere. That monopoly could not last forever. The most famous breach came through the Dutch. In the late 1600s, the Dutch East India Company managed to smuggle coffee seedlings out of Yemen and successfully cultivated them in Java, in what is now Indonesia. From this single act of botanical theft, an entire Dutch colonial coffee industry emerged, one that would later expand to Ceylon and beyond, and give rise to the term "a cup of Java" as a nickname for coffee itself. The French tell an equally dramatic story. According to a popular account, a French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu obtained a coffee seedling from the Royal Botanical Garden in Paris around 1723 and transported it across the Atlantic to the French colony of Martinique, supposedly sharing his own limited water ration with the plant during a difficult voyage to keep it alive. Historians note that parts of this story have likely been dramatized over time, but what is well documented is that coffee cultivation did take root in Martinique in this period, and from there spread rapidly through the French Caribbean. Then came Brazil. Legend holds that in 1727, a Portuguese official named Francisco de Melo Paleta was sent to French Guiana to settle a border dispute and used the opportunity to seduce the French governor's wife, who secretly gave him coffee seedlings hidden inside a bouquet of flowers as a parting gift. It is a romantic story, and like several coffee origin tales, its precise details are difficult to verify. What is certain is that coffee cultivation reached Brazil in this era, and the country's vast, fertile land proved almost perfectly suited to growing it at a scale nowhere else on Earth could match. By the 1800s, Brazil had become the dominant force in global coffee production, a position it still holds today, producing roughly a third of the world's coffee supply. But this expansion came at a devastating human cost. Brazil's coffee boom, along with plantations across the Caribbean, was built overwhelmingly on the labor of enslaved Africans, forcibly transported and worked under brutal conditions to satisfy Europe's growing appetite for the drink. Brazil did not abolish slavery until 1888, one of the last countries in the Americas to do so, and historians largely agree that the enormous profitability of coffee exports was a significant factor in prolonging the institution there. The comfort of a European coffeehouse conversation and the suffering of a Brazilian coffee plantation were, quite literally, connected by the same cup. It is a difficult truth, but an essential one. Coffee's rise as a global commodity cannot be separated from the exploitation that made its mass production possible. As the 1800s progressed, coffee was no longer a luxury sipped by philosophers in candlelit rooms. It was becoming something else entirely, a fuel, and the machines of a new industrial age were about to demand it in quantities no one had ever imagined. The Industrial Revolution did not just change how things were made, it changed how humans were expected to work, and coffee became the drink that made that new expectation bearable. Factory labor demanded something entirely unnatural, waking before dawn, working in rigid shifts, staying alert around dangerous machinery for 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours at a time. Alcohol, long a common daytime drink in earlier centuries, was incompatible with operating heavy machinery. Coffee, cheap and increasingly available thanks to colonial plantations, filled the gap perfectly. By the mid-1800s, coffee had become deeply embedded in working-class daily life across Europe and North America, not a luxury, but a necessity, as essential to a factory shift as the shift itself. War accelerated coffee's importance even further. During the American Civil War, Union soldiers were issued coffee rations, and it's said many carried small hand grinders directly into battle, brewing coffee over campfires between engagements. During both World Wars, coffee became a strategic resource. The United States military prioritized coffee shipments to boost troop morale, and it was during World War II that instant coffee, first commercially developed decades earlier, was mass-produced and distributed to soldiers by the millions, prized for how quickly it could be prepared in field conditions. That wartime demand helped make instant coffee a household staple across America and Europe for decades afterward, valued for speed and convenience over ceremony. Then, in the second half of the 20th century, coffee split into two distinct identities. On one path, mass market convenience. Companies like Nescafé and Folgers built empires on the idea that coffee should be fast, cheap, and available everywhere. On the other path, ceremony and craft. Starting in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1990s with the rise of Starbucks and countless independent roasters, a specialty coffee movement emerged, one obsessed with origin, roast profile, brewing method, and the reintroduction of coffee as an experience rather than merely a stimulant. The coffee house, in a strange historical echo, was reborn, once again a place to sit, work, meet, and talk, not unlike the cafés of Ottoman Cairo 4 centuries earlier. Today, coffee is one of the most traded commodities on Earth, supporting the livelihoods of roughly 120 million people worldwide across growing, processing, trading, and retail. It fuels a global industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars, moves through everything from single-origin specialty cafés to vending machines in office break rooms, and remains, for a huge share of humanity, the very first ritual of the day. So let's return to the question we started with. How did a small, wild berry from the Ethiopian highlands come to reshape religion, trade, empires, revolutions, and the daily rhythm of billions of human lives? The honest answer is that coffee never set out to change history. It simply gave humans something they didn't know they needed, a way to stay alert, to gather, to talk, to think a little sharper and a little longer than their bodies would naturally allow. Sufi mystics used that gift for prayer. Enlightenment philosophers used it to sharpen revolutionary ideas. Factory owners used it to extend a workday. Soldiers used it to survive one more battle. And ordinary people, across 4 centuries and 6 continents, simply used it to get through the morning. That is the quiet, extraordinary truth hiding inside your next cup of coffee. It is not just caffeine. It is the residue of monasteries and empires, of smuggled seedlings and burned coffee houses, of philosophers arguing until dawn, and enslaved laborers working fields they never chose to work. The next time you lift that cup to your lips, you are not just waking up. You are taking a sip of 600 years of human history and continuing a ritual that has already outlasted empires, revolutions, and everything else it helped create.